Luke 16, verses 1 to 12. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Then he asked the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with very much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in your handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No servant can serve two masters. Either you'll hate one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." So Jesus tells a parable about a dishonest manager. And the parables, we started last week and we did some a few years ago as well. They're real stories with kingdom truth. They're real stories that show kingdom dynamics. So they're rooted in the world Jesus is speaking to. So they talk about farming, they talk about money, they talk about workers and servants and lamps. They talk about all real stuff people at the time could relate to. But they talk about kingdom truth. So they often flip how the world behaves. And it's similar in this one. The listeners at the time would have clicked with what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about a manager and a master. And at the time, these masters had huge estates. They were sort of like lords of the land. And they would be very detached from their estates. They would often hire a manager or have a slave who was a manager who would run these estates. But this wasn't a bad situation for any manager to be in, for any worker to be in. This was a position of respect, of influence. In fact, they had so much authority, they were able to make all the decisions that the master would otherwise make. They had the same authority as the master. And because they had the same authority as the master, they got similar respect to the master. Not as much, but similar respect. They had similar responsibilities to the master. They were taught well of, and they had good connections all around. So it was a nice position to be in. In fact, it was so nice, some people would sell themselves into slavery if the promise was there to be a manager of a large estate. But the master had received damning reports. He'd seen the yearly forecast, and they were credible. He calls in the manager and tells him, "Get your things together, get your affairs in order, give me my final report, and then get out of here." And what's interesting about this is he actually knows that the manager has the accounts ready. He knows the manager has kept diligent accounts. So it's not an issue with the manager's ability to do the job. Rather, he took certain liberties. It was like he was maybe getting a work expense trip for his meals, but he decided to do his Christmas shopping on his work expenses and then hand in the receipt. He was being a bit liberal with the privilege he was afforded in his work. And this caused a huge concern for the manager at the time. As we see in verse 3, he didn't want to dig. He was too good for that. And he definitely didn't want to beg. He was definitely too good for that. And you can imagine the scenario, can't you? If a doctor, for example, up in Daisy Hill, head of surgery, of cutting people open or sawing bones, whatever you call them, was deregistered, was struck off the doctor register. And yeah, they could go work at McDonald's, but they probably wouldn't. It's just too low a step down. And it's the same for this manager. So the manager's concerns are, how can he get a free ride in life? How can he continue with the same comfort, the same respect to some degree, the same finances as he's always had? And his decision is to get a patron, someone who'd look after him. And again, people at the time, they would have clicked with this. This is a weird setup for us, but they didn't have social systems at the time. They didn't have charity organizations, but what they did have were patrons. If you were poor, if you were less well off, you could go to someone's house who was more well off, and you could ask them for a loan. You could ask them to show some goodness to you. And if they did, it would benefit them as well, because it would enhance their honor, would enhance their prestige. They would be well known, well liked, well respected in their community. But of course, to get a patron to adopt you, to take you on, they had to like you. So he invites all the debtors round, and these were wealthy men because they owed huge sums of money. He invites all the debtors round, and as you see in verse 7 and verse 8, he cuts their bills one in half and one by 20%. But it's how he does it. It's insidious. He asks them, "How much do you owe?" And the manager would have known this, because at the very start of any legal transaction, any lending, the debtor would write down a note of how much they owe, and they would hand it over. And until they've paid that off, they would not get their note back. So the manager, he has it all there before him. So the reason he asks them, "How much do you owe?" is purely psychological. He wants to manipulate. He wants to just drive home how much he's going to knock off their bill. So for one of them, he knocks off half of it. The other, he knocks off 20%. But you know what's really strange about this situation, about this parable? It's verse 8, isn't it? If you read verse 8 with me, the master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in their dealing. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends. Not only does the master commend him, but Jesus holds him up as an example. So what is going on here? What is going on with this manager who's being fired, who's being let go, who is acting maliciously, who's manipulating? Why is the master not happy with him, but impressed by him? And why is Jesus holding him up as an example to his disciples of how the kingdom of God works? Because remember, these are real stories showing kingdom truth. Well, people at the time, I think, would have clicked with what the manager has done. And it's clever. The manager's called him in, and what he's knocked off is not the master's money, but he's knocked off his own commission. Because as manager of the estates, he was entitled to a certain amount of commission from each one of these transactions. And one of them was 50% because oil is cheap, the other was 20% because wheat was a lot more expensive at the time. So he's knocked off his commission. Now, what's happened then? Why is the master commending? Why? Because the master has lost nothing. The master has lost nothing. In fact, the master has gained something. He's known as a generous man who reduces the bills of his debtors. His honor has been enhanced. But what has the manager lost? Well, the manager, he's lost 3 years digging wages. He's lost those 3 years menial wages. 3 years of wages that, you know what, the rest of the time he would have got no problem. But what has he gained? He's gained a patron. So he's taken the small sacrifice in the short term to gain the long-term reward. But why does Jesus applaud him? We can understand why the master, he's impressed by his ingenuity. He's not happy with him, but fair play to him. He's figured a way out of this situation that puts him on the best footing without doing further damage. But why does Jesus applaud him? Why does Jesus hold him up as an example? Well, first of all, we need to see here, Jesus calls him the dishonest manager in verse 8. It's Jesus who labels him as a dishonest manager. So he is not applauding his motives. He is not saying his heart is in the right place. But he does highlight his cunning, his shrewdness, his intelligence. And it really distills into one sentence that Jesus has in Matthew's Gospel. He says to his disciples, "Be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves." As shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. So be clever, but do it with honesty. It's sort of the idea of someone goes to get an entry-level job and they work there for 2-3 years. They have no intention of staying at the company. They don't enjoy the work they're doing. They don't see this as their long-term goal. But they apply themselves as hard as they can. Why? Because they know in 2 years' time they'll be able to go somewhere else for a huge promotion. So you know what? They're taking the short-term sacrifice for the long-term gain. And Jesus highlights him as an example because parables are not allegories. We're not meant to see connections at every single point with our lives or with the lives of people or with Jesus. They are not exact examples that we're meant to draw from every single point to what it's like to live in the kingdom. Rather, they're analogies where we see similarities between the story, the parable, and how we should live. And that's what Jesus does. He takes three points from this. And he does this in verses 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. From verses 8 to 13, about how we should live. We should have wisdom, integrity, and live selflessly in our relationships to others and to money. We should have wisdom, integrity, and live selflessly. Peter? And for many of Jesus' parables, we have to bridge the gap to who Jesus is talking to who Luke is writing to, and to the world today. We don't see immediately how it connects. But when it comes to money, I don't think we need to jump just as far. The bridge is just a bit smaller. Yeah, our currency has changed, our banking system has changed from the time, but people still pursue money. It's still the main drive in so many of our lives. It's still what causes nations to rise and fall, to gamble with the lives of millions, the chance to be more wealthy. It's what causes people to take up risky ventures throughout generations and to take on risky roles like fighting in foreign wars. Money is still what makes a lot of the world go round, and it was no different at Jesus' day. So I don't think the gap is as large for us to bridge. But Jesus says first, we should have wisdom. And I find the story of Chuck Feeney particularly interesting. I think we've mentioned him before. He was a billionaire who made his money on the duty-free businesses in airports. He had actually $8 billion in the 1980s. And he resolved in the 1980s to get rid of all his money, to donate as much of it as possible and just to live modestly. He actually finished doing that this year. It took over 40 years. Why? Because he could have just poured it out into one charity. He could have just donated it to a government. But he wanted to act shrewdly. He wanted to act with wisdom to benefit the most people in the most profitable ways. This week, Ireland announced a sovereign wealth fund. And again, this is another example of wisdom, of shrewdness. They could have repaved the roads and given Donegal a motorway system for some reason. But instead, they chose to invest it wisely for future generations instead of having a big, glamorous project. That's an example of shrewdness, of wisdom. And Jesus says, be shrewd to gain friends in verse 9. But he wants to mark a difference. The world uses wealth for its advantage. The only way you're going to gain friends in the world using your wealth is if it's to benefit you. And that's what the manager does here. He uses his wealth. He takes off those 3 years' wages to gain some friends who will look after him. He'll probably end up paying more than 3 years' worth of wages to support him. But he says, we should use wealth for God's glory. So he does not set on his disciples in verses 9, he doesn't set any expectation that they will receive anything from these friends. Rather, he says, use your wealth to gain friends. So what's he saying? Use your worldly wealth to bless people now, so that you can bless them with heavenly wealth as well, so you can bring the gospel to them. Because chapter 15 is all about how much more precious it is for someone to come to God, to return to God, than anything else in the world. And Jesus is now showing them, if you are to value people coming to know God, well, your worldly wealth should be nothing to you. It should be a simple tool helping you bridge that gap towards people, allowing you to bring them the good news of Jesus. So he's saying be shrewd, be wise. Pick those moments, pick those people, pick those institutes, those missions that will have the biggest impact. But the biggest impact in the kingdom is not the most visible. It's not what's going to end up on the front page of the newspaper. The biggest impact is what will open someone's heart the most. So that could mean the single mother who you know is short on electricity because prices have jumped, that lives on your street. It could mean maybe topping up her meter for her. It's not going to make it on Facebook. It's not going to make it on the nightly news. It's not going to become viral on TikTok. But it's going to have the biggest impact on her life, and it'll open the door for the gospel. And we already do this, if you think about it, with how we do our evangelism. We try to plan events that are attractive, but also that are true. We try to do things that will bless people, for example, like Docus on Saturdays, but that will allow us to bless them even more with the good news of the gospel. And think of what a clear statement it would send to the world if the church was generous, if those of us in the church were generous with what we had. At a time where everyone is so concerned of preserving as much of their wealth as possible, of preserving as much the quality of their lifestyle, if we were, maybe not reckless, but if we were wise in giving our money to the poor, to charities, to those that are our neighbours. See, because the difference is, we're not looking to be welcomed in by people. We're not looking to gain friends for our benefits. Rather, as Jesus points out, we're looking to be welcomed in by God, and hopefully we'll have a lot of other people to lead in along with us. The reward is not from those you bless, but from your heavenly Father. And maybe this is you, and you think, every time I try to do this, that's my desire. I would love to be more fruitful with my money. Every time I try to do this, I look at my bank account at the end of the month, and I have £20 left. I'm in overdraft. I only have scraps that I can give. There's just no way I can be fruitful with my money. Well, Jesus commands his disciples here to be wise. So let me make a suggestion on how you can be wise in this area. First of all, build a budget. If you've never built a budget, build an honest budget about where your money is going, how much you're getting in, and look at, are there areas in my life that I can maybe shave off something here to bless others? Secondly, if you're maybe finding it hard to get control so that you can bless others, maybe think of starting accountability. We have accountability for a lot of other things in life, where we need help. Why not speak to an older Christian, one of the elders? Maybe grab a few of the men or women here and go, look, let's set financial goals of how we want to bless. We do this with financial advisors when we say we want to have 200,000 by the time we're 55 saved up in our pension. So why not do this for even more, for a heavenly reward? Why not do this for true treasure, to bless others and to worship God? But let me be clear. This is not a sermon that's telling you simply to give more. It's not a sermon that's telling you to give more. If you're maybe not part of this church, this can help you maybe think about how you give to your church. If you're not giving to this church and this is your church, and you're in a position to do so, well, let me encourage you. Yes, then this is definitely a challenge to give to the Lord's work, but this is not a message to give more in general. In fact, let me encourage you. This church gives a huge amount. I know many people here give to the work of the church. They give to charities, they give to mission organizations, they use their money to bless those within the church and those without on a personal basis. So it is not a call to give more, but to give well. Not to give more, but to give well. To think about how we give. We all plan for Christmas. We all maybe do it with military precision. I have every single cheese planned out that I'm going to spend money on already. We all think of who we're going to buy gifts for, what events we're going to do, who we're going to have over their home, what Christmas dinners we're going to attend, because there's so many of those. But let me encourage you, we're all probably going to start planning for Christmas in the next few weeks. It's going to be November soon. Why don't you plan during the Christmas season for how you can bless others, how you can use your wealth, your possessions to bless others, whether it's through hospitality, whether it's through the giving of gifts, whether it's through supporting charitable initiatives. Plan well. It's not a call to give more, but to give well. Next, Jesus, the next 2 points are a bit shorter, tells them to give with integrity, verses 10 to 12. To give with integrity. Peter, he tells them to give with integrity. Let me ask you, would you trust a politician to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, Minister of Finance, if they were in debt? You wouldn't. Would you trust someone to become a principal of school if they're abusive to their kids? Would you trust someone to be an elder of a church if their home is an absolute mess? You wouldn't. Jesus is telling his disciples to have integrity, to be trustworthy with what they have. See, the difference though between the kingdom and how the world acts, the difference between the manager and the disciples, is they are clear in their motivation. They are clear in their motivations. The manager manipulates. He uses it for his own benefit. The disciples want to bless. The disciples of the kingdom simply want to bless. So it's a call for integrity. Integrity can be honesty, but it can also mean to work diligently with what we have been given. Not looking for more, or saying if we simply had a bit more, we could sort it. See, Jesus is speaking to incredibly poor men. His disciples were not rich. Maybe some of them were better off, but most of them were fishermen. They were labor workers at the time. They didn't have much. Yet he's still telling them to give with integrity with what little they have. As he says in verse 10, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with very much. He's saying whatever you have right now, use it well. Work diligently with it. That means not looking and saying, if we simply had a bit more, we could do so much more. If we simply had just this extra, we could do so much more. It means for us as a church, not saying if we simply had 5 more gifted people, 5 more people in these areas, imagine how much more evangelism we could do. Imagine how many people we could bring to the Lord. Look, that might be true, but we do not have 5 more people. It means not saying, if I only got an extra £200 in wages each month, imagine how much more I could give. Look, that might be true, but you don't have 200 more pounds. Use what you have wisely now. It might mean, if I can just squeeze an extra 3 hours of time out, I can serve someone, I can be of benefit to someone. That might be true, but you don't have those 3 hours. Use what you have well, diligently now. It means seeking to do the best you can for God with what you have. Jesus is speaking to his poor disciples, and he is telling them, you might not have much, but use what you have for the best you possibly can. So shrewdness says, look at what you can do that makes the biggest impact. It's really asking, why this and not that? Integrity is saying, do the best you possibly can for others with what you have. And let me encourage you, we're actually going to do that not just on an individual level when we go home, but we're actually going to do that on the 19th of November here as a church. We're going to have our vision and distinctive session, and we're going to be looking here as a church. How can we act wisely, and how can we act with integrity with everything God has given us? So let me encourage you, come along to that, so we together as a church can act with wisdom and with integrity. But Jesus' message here is an antidote to a world that bombards you, that tells you constantly, love money, desire money, that tells you you should always be increasing in what you have. You should have more in your 30s than you do in your 20s. You should have more in your 40s than you do in your 30s. That holds out the idea of a fulfilled life as one that goes on sunny holidays, that has a nice car, that's always out eating meals and sipping coffee. Let me comfort you, Christian. Do not be dismayed if you're not an investment banker this morning, if you don't have a portfolio, if you don't own a home, if you are on minimum wage. Rather, Jesus says, be responsible for what you have. That is what God has given you. Why? Because he has true riches in store for you. He says, be responsible where he's put you. Why? Because there are greater lands to come in the kingdom of God. And last, he tells him to act selflessly. And this comes down to the real heart of the thing. The manager loved money. Jesus is commanding his disciples to love God. In verse 13, he says this. He makes clear, money is not from us, and it is not for us. Money is not from us, and it is not for us. Rather, we cannot serve both God and money. Why? Because they have polar opposite desires. Money says, come to me and I will make you happy, and it just keeps you chasing. God says, I will come to you and I will fulfill you. They're polar opposites. You cannot serve both. And we're giving in to love of money if we are unwilling to assess our giving. If we're unwilling to go, well, it pops into our head and we think, maybe I do have a problem. Going, no, you know what, I'm fine. I'm giving right, I'm giving well. And we just wash our hands of it. If we're unwilling to even sit down and think about it, we're probably struggling with love of money. Maybe you figured it all out, but we're probably struggling with love of money. When we love money, in fact, even if we have none. Why? Because it becomes the one thing we think we're missing in life. We maybe have family, we have friends, we have health, but we think, if I just had a bit more money to set my feet down comfortably, that would sort my life. But Jesus gives us a solution to break the hold money has on us. And it's simply this: understanding who it's from and who it is for. Money is from God, and it is for the glory of God. That means we use it for others. Think of what we are saying if we use our money generously. If you're less well off, what are you saying if you use your money generously? You are saying, God is enough for me. And look, if you're more well off here today, if you have been blessed financially by the Lord, and you use your money generously to bless others, what are you saying? God is enough for me. And verse 13 is the most detached point from the parable. It's probably the hardest one to take out of the parable, but because Jesus says it here, obviously we're going to say it. But I think there's a reason why Jesus ends on this point. He's getting to the root of the matter. The world loves money. We love God. And we show that using our money. But he's holding up the distinction between money as a master and God as a master. See, money as a master will never give you enough. There is never a number in your account that will be large enough. Never a number in your account that will satisfy. But God gave himself for you. Money as your master works you hard. It drives you and it works you to the bone. God as your master says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Money as your master will put you into debt. God as your master wipes away your debts. See, money as your master will never, ever give us enough. But God as our master gave himself for us. And there's the distinction. I think that's probably enough there, but let's pray as we think of how we can glorify God going forward as a church and as an individual.